Right. Okay. And it should be asking everyone's consent for recording because we are recording. So my name is Jordan Slappey, and I'm a first-year seminary student at PLTS in Berkeley. I'm working with Pastor Megan and Grace Lutheran as their, I don't exactly know what it's called, field education or site placement work. It's not quite internship, but I'm working with them right now for that part of my studies. And today I'm going to be giving a talk on martyrs. For anyone participating, I have you all minimized. So if you want to say something, just go ahead and say it. Feel free to interrupt me. I'll try to kind of pay attention for hands or whatever, but you're all tiny. And I'm going to start off with just a disclaimer. Martyrdom is not an entirely Christian idea, but I'm coming at it from a Christian perspective. We weren't the first people to identify folks as martyrs. And I don't think we were the last group of people to do that either, but this is just a place that I can speak with some level of authority from, or I'm the most fluent in the Christian language and the ways of understanding things. So I'm just going to kind of stay where I'm comfortable and acknowledge the fact that this isn't completely our idea. I also want to say that I'm learning. This is intended to be a conversation starter or a conversation, hopefully. And not so much of a lecture necessarily. I came into this project with a different idea or different intent than I'm coming out of it with. So there's that. And also I have a point, I promise. It may not always seem like it, but I do. And I'll get there eventually. And you don't have to agree. So like I said, it's a conversation. So with all of that said, I just wanted to start off with what a martyr is. You might have some idea or have some experience with the word, but for anyone who doesn't, I went straight to the good old dictionary and found that a martyr is a person who's killed because of their beliefs. Some people make religious belief a qualifier for being a martyr, but that's not necessarily a component in all definitions. But a martyr is also defined as someone who exaggerates their sacrifice to get sympathy. So we kind of have two ways of looking at the word there. And then Merriam-Webster even furthers that and says that a martyr or witness of Christ is a person who, though they have never seen, I jumped. That's the Catholic definition. The Merriam-Webster one says that to be a martyr is to act like someone who deserves admiration or sympathy because of being badly treated. So there's another one, the negative. And another positive one, we're going to hit the Catholic definition. And they said that a martyr or a witness of Christ, which is taking the original Greek word. I don't know if it was from Doric or Koine Greek, but it was martus. And it was used for a long time in a non-biblical term. And it was primarily used in a legal context. So it's just someone who spoke from observation or provided a proclamation or a testimony. So Aristotle and I think Plato used those mostly in that respect. And the early church, I suppose, would have used it in that respect as well. It wasn't until I think the first century with Saint Stephen that we actually attributed the name of martyr to someone. So that the Catholic definition uses that, and it's a person who has never seen or heard the divine founder of the church, but is so firmly convinced of the truth of Christian religion that they would gladly suffer death rather than deny it. So just out of the gate, we already have two really different worldly views of what it is to be a martyr. Good and bad. So after that, I'm going to kind of get into why I'm interested. I grew up fundamentalist. I was later in life brought into the Lutheran Church. So the upbringing that I had really glorified martyrs and all that meant. I grew up hearing really fanciful tales about them. The popular one was told in a couple different variations, but the general idea is the same. You're in an active shooter situation, particularly in a school. That's the way that I was told it. And the gunman goes down the line. The listener knows that all the people in this line are Christians. But the gunman does not. So he goes down the line and asks, are you a Christian? Are you a Christian? Are you a Christian? And everyone down the line goes, no. Until you get to the last person, who's generally a more sympathetic character, like a little girl or a teenage boy or someone who has their whole life ahead of them. And they say yes. And the shooter pulls the trigger. But somehow there's always something, a Bible in their pocket, or some sort of devotional book, or a cross that the bullet gets stuck in or bounces off of, saving them. But the point is, then the Sunday school teacher, or I went to a private elementary school, my elementary school teacher would say, now, who would deny being a follower of Christ? That's what Peter did, and we don't want to be like that. So, they would just look around and say, so who would say that they knew Jesus? And all the kids would shoot up their hands like, me, I would. And I was kind of like, sure. I don't want to be the only one who wouldn't. That seems kind of awful. So, I'd hesitantly raise my hand, but in my head the whole time I'm going like, I still believe in God either way, and this way I get to keep living and continuing to believe in God. I've never understood, even from the time I was little, the call to be a martyr. So that not only tainted my view of martyrs, but also kind of has just led me to build a more unsympathetic view towards them as I continued going on, and especially when I studied religion and then got into seminary. But recently, the person who suggested that I take a different look at this may or may not be here. But I was turned on to a different way of looking at martyrs, and I will get into that as I start just kind of talking about martyrs throughout history. So I wanted to start with Saint Stephen, not because he's a particular favorite of mine or anything. He's just the first one that I found the title of martyr to be attributed to within the Christian church. He was killed in 36 CE for speaking against the holy place of Jerusalem and then law. He was ordered to come in front of the Sanhedrin, which were assemblies of either 23 or 71 elders, known as rabbis, post the destruction of the Second Temple, which is around 70 CE. So St. Stephen would have been talking to just community elders who still had authority like rabbis. But they would sit in the tribunal and basically take on questions of faith or questions of order within Jerusalem as a whole. And so he was charged with, he took issue with, he felt like Jerusalem had been built up as an idol. And he thought that that was kind of a betrayal of faith. So he wasn't necessarily, it's unclear whether or not he assigned any significance to Jesus's death. But one thing that he was known for is wanting to return back to Mosaic law, which was they were not big on the idols, if you remember. So he was doing that, and that was contrary to the ideas of faith at the time. So in defending his faith in that way, in front of the Sanhedrin, he was found to be I don't know, maybe an enemy of the state. I'm not sure if that's an appropriate term, but he was found to be guilty, and he was taken outside and stoned. He's the first recognized martyr. One thing I do want to note is that his story detailed in Acts chapter 7 has been used in a lot of really nasty ways to support anti-Semitism, especially there's a point in time at which he says that your hearts and your ears are uncircumcised, and that has been really used just to kind of build up contempt against Jewish faith leaders. And anti-Semitism is always wrong, and I just want to say that that has been used for that. We're not using it for that. I'm simply using it to make an example of the first, or not make an example, but to detail the life and times of the first martyr. So after the apostolic age, we're going to make a little bit of a jump. I have kind of an agenda here. So we're going to shift, and we're going to talk about Perpetua next. Perpetua, this story is in question as to whether or not it actually happened, or if it's maybe been made more fanciful or heroic over time, embellished to make a point. But Perpetua and Felicity, which was, I think, her slave, were preparing for baptism I think they lived in North Africa, but I'm not entirely sure about that. They were preparing for baptism. They were arrested by the state. It was against the rules to be openly and outwardly Christian. It was against the rules to get baptized into a new identity that was something other than the Roman state. It's not good for people to have different religious ideas and ideologies, and it's really not good for people who are so adamant about their Christian faith that they would defy these laws that are in existence in order to get baptized. So she and her other friends who were preparing for baptism, as well as Felicity, were taken and arrested. And then this is where the story starts to get interesting. So Perpetua was put in jail, and it said that her father visited her and begged her for the hairs on his gray head that she would renounce her Christian faith for his sake, because he is her father and loves her, and just come back and live with him. The version of the stories that I was reading said that she had a son, and so he was also imploring her to, for the sake of her son, renounce her Christian faith and make a sacrifice to the emperor to show that she was solidly off the Christian wagon. And she refused. The story that I read said that she looked over at a vase and said, "See that vase? Can it be anything other than a vase?" And Dad was like, "Well, no, Dad, it's a vase." And she was like, "Well, I'm a Christian, so get over it. Can't be anything that I'm not." So she goes to trial. And then again, her father, who loves her, bursts into the courtroom, this time carrying her son, and says, "Please, Perpetua, for the love of me and your son," maybe not God here, I don't even think that would have won her any points, do not give yourself over to be sacrificed for this. Just defend your life and keep living and keep being a mom, and you can keep doing you. But she says no, she cannot. She refuses to make the sacrifice or renounce her Christian identity because she's so strong in her faith. So she's taken into the arena along with her friends and Felicity, and they are all killed for their beliefs, gladiator style. Rough. So we're going to jump forward again. We're going to visit Marguerite Peretti. I'm not sure if that's how you say her last name. It sounds like Chelsea Peretti's last name, so that's where I get stuck. Getting nods. But she was born in the 13th century in France, and she was a member of the Beguine movement. For anyone who's not familiar with that movement, as I was not until semi-recently, these are a group of women who lived in a community with the intent, with the right intentions of a religious order, but they never actually became a religious order. So none of them were bound. They didn't take any vows. None of that. They were all just kind of there on their own volition, and they could leave whenever they wanted. They were considered to be semi-monastic though, and they definitely tended towards mysticism in their beliefs. And central to their beliefs was that they live in imitation of Christ. So Marguerite, being one of these women, and having a flair for the mystic, decided, or not, I don't know if she decided, but she wrote and published and talked about God as love and love as God, and talked about all people being part of one divine soul, which has no other will but God's. And that was apparently wildly heretical. God is not love. People are not part of the divine. People are horrible. And so she was deemed a heretic for these beliefs in 1306, and then burned at the stake for refusing to renounce her heretical beliefs in 1310. So moving on from Joan, moving on from Marguerite to Joan, not moving far in time or location. Joan of Arc is our next martyr. She was also born in France shortly after Marguerite in the grand scheme of things. When she was 14 years old, she had a vision in which she was visited by the archangel Michael and some other angels as well. And they told her that she was meant to drive the English out of France. So Joan was born during the 100 Years' War, which started in 1337. She was born in 1412, so she was kind of born towards the end of things. Or maybe not, towards the kind of middle. And I don't know, she was born into conflict. And the 100 Years' War was fought between the French and the English over who had the right to rule France. Joan is not necessarily thrilled about this call. She said that she would have much rather stayed home to spin wool, but whenever you're visited by Michael, the archangel, and a bunch of other angels, it's a pretty hard thing to say no to. So what did she do? She put on men's armor and she went to fight. She was captured, condemned, and then sentenced to death in 1431 for the repeat offense of cross-dressing. Shout out to a fellow cross-dresser. Her mother insisted that she be retried after her death. Her mom was obviously pretty upset that her daughter was killed, especially killed fighting for justice, and then God ordained justice for her country. And so she was retried and then declared innocent in 1456. So she got a little bit of resolution, just not in her lifetime. All right, and now we're gonna make a pretty big time jump to World War II, and we're gonna talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a pastor during World War II, and he was killed by the Nazi state for preaching anti-Nazi rhetoric. But that's not where the story ends. He was accused of being involved in an assassination plot of Adolf Hitler, which didn't happen, but he was tried along with the other people who were accused of plotting. And then he was hanged on April 9th, 1945, a short 20-something days before Adolf Hitler committed suicide and ended that part of the whole thing. So those are the kind of modern, or not modern necessarily, but those are a few recognized Christian martyrs that I wanted to bring attention to. Before we move into one other Christian martyr that has been interesting for me to try to work into my worldview, and this is where I would welcome and love discussion in particular. Thinking about Jesus as a martyr, it seems kind of on the nose for me. Was he the original Christian martyr? Can we say that he was martyred? He went willingly to it and knew that it had to happen. And also, I don't know, I think I have problems because it was something that was like supposed to happen. And so he takes all the martyr boxes because he was killed for his beliefs. And he was speaking out on behalf of the oppressed and speaking for justice. And so, but that would make me think that he was a martyr. He was also an enemy of the state because he would whip the crowds he was talking to into fervors and frenzies, and that wasn't necessarily safe. Kind of like the whole Perpetua thing. They weren't big on folks who were dissenters. So I'm not really sure. Part of me wants to say, yeah, absolutely. Jesus was certainly a martyr, and probably a good example, I guess, for Christian martyrs, especially those like Marguerite who are trying to imitate the life of Christ through their martyrdom, or maybe not through it, but in their lives. I'm not sure. Does anyone have any thoughts about Jesus as martyr?
Hi, my name's Karen. And I think I can see where you're coming from. You know, so so I appreciate that you said martyrs weren't just a Christian thing, because Jesus was not a Christian, he was a Jew, but he was still crucified he was tried as an enemy of the state. He was executed for inciting rebellion. And, you know, I think it's a larger discussion whenever you bring in the ideas of atonement theory. And so for atonement theory, for me, as someone who does not embrace atonement theory, maybe you could think like if God, separate from Jesus, demanded that Jesus be crucified for the sins of the world, then does that make Jesus a martyr because of what the Father wanted Jesus to do? I mean, obviously, I'm more of the opinion that Jesus is God and the Holy Spirit. As a Trinitarian, I believe that Jesus went willingly to the cross. I don't know. It's a really compelling question, Jordan.
That's the sticky point for me too, though, is, you know, it's a, to separate them for a moment. It's a God ordained task. I mean, it's the same, different. But you know, what is that? Does that have implications? Because I don't think that martyrdom is entirely Christian, and I am about to talk about some secular martyrs, so that's why this question is right here. But I don't know. Judith, do you have any thoughts? It's okay if you don't.
Well, you know, it's interesting because I'm not a seminarian or a pastor per se. But I was curious about this topic today. And so it, you know, coming from, so I'm a somatic movement therapist and a dancer. So a lot of times I come from an embodied place. And kind of just how I think about everything. So I really appreciated the thought that Jesus was God, because I think we all are on a certain level. And so if people are trying to be Christ-like or trying to be of Christ and, you know, or of God, or, you know, let's just say, since we're talking the Christian martyr right now, I don't want to, because I know you're going to talk about other things, then what were they trying to emanate? Were they trying, so it sounded like a lot of them were trying to emanate Christ, but I think if we kind of dig in deeper, they're trying to be of a godly nature, and they're trying to bring God into the world by how they live their life. And I mean, that's what Christ was doing. He was bringing God, he was embodying God to be in the world. So in that sense of it, maybe he was being a martyr in the sense of being God and, you know, being embodied or being incarnate. So he was, so I could see that, I can see the martyr argument pretty clearly. And, you know, I think it's hard for us because we are really into separating everything in our culture. You know, you learn biology over here, you learn math over here, you know, you're either this or that, you know, and we're very into splitting off. And so if we don't split off, then yeah, I can really see him as a martyr. If we do split off, then that's a little trickier. So I'm kind of more of the holistic point of view. So those are my thoughts.
I really appreciate that, bringing the, what'd you have to say?
I was just going to say to Judah, thank you for sharing what you said. And whenever you said you were a movement therapist and a dancer, and you brought about embodiment, just that word, that just like sparked like, ooh, in my head. And so thank you for giving me at least a different way to think about this, because I am not a dancer. Yeah, so, and often feel awkward in my body. So to be able to incorporate all those things and think about it in such a beautiful way, that was nice.
Yeah, I second that. I really appreciated the talking about embodiment, and then the even distinguishing how we're so into splitting things off in society today. And I didn't even think about that being a factor in how I was thinking about martyrdom, but I put it on very separate tracks, most certainly whenever I was looking at it. So thank you for bringing that to my attention.
So then the other kind of to dovetail off of that is that we even say mind, body, spirit. We have to even that phrase is separating it out, right? Mm-hmm. Or you know, you say the body instead of my body, you know, so those are ways that we split off. So I'm gonna not to plug myself, but to be a resource, I'm gonna put my website in the chat box, and you can go on my blog and read ways that you can embody yourself. And if you want to sign up for my newsletter, my email newsletter, you can, and then you would get stuff about once a week, maybe 2-3 times a month. I send something out that are ways for you to go ahead and participate in your body in that way.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And with that, we're going to move into the secular idea of what, or secular examples of martyrdom. You all asked, I think, a pretty valid question, or a question was raised in hearing you all talk, and that's kind of, are we called to become martyrs, or in following Jesus, or what does that look like? And we're going to touch on that a little bit later. That chat. We're going to touch on that a little bit later, but right now we're going to move into the secular martyrs. So in no particular order, I'm going to start with a pretty famous one that I feel like a lot of people will be familiar with, and that's Martin Luther King Jr. He was assassinated in, I believe, 1968 after one of his speeches by James Earl Ray for his place in the civil rights movement. He was an outspoken advocate for the civil rights movement, so for securing voting rights and protections for Black folks and other people of color in America. Before voting rights and other basic rights were extended to all people, this isn't a talk about that. So I'm going to kind of glance, in order to talk about martyrs, I'm going to leave a lot unsaid. I'm not going to really I'm not going to go into great detail what happened to these folks or any of the controversy surrounding maybe who killed them or anything like that. We're just going to talk about folks that are martyrs and why they're considered martyrs today, particularly in our US context. And it can be argued that MLK was also a religious martyr because he did he did fight for equality from a religious place, especially being a reverend doctor. But right now we're just talking about the fact that he was a secular martyr, murdered for a secular issue in the United States. And then after that, we're moving on to Harvey Milk. Harvey Milk moved from New York City to San Francisco and was elected to a position as a San Francisco city supervisor. While he was a supervisor, he was really instrumental, along with the mayor, in implementing a bill that would provide anti-discrimination protections, or provide protection from discrimination for LGBTQ folks on the basis of sexual identity in regards to housing and employment. Dan White shot Harvey Milk and the mayor of San Francisco, not as a result of this, from what I can tell. I haven't found any records of him being a homophobe or anything. This one, I toyed with the idea of putting it in or not. Milk is 100% recognized as a martyr in the LGBTQ community. I have heard him spoken of in this manner for years and years. And so whether or not he actually was a martyr for this kind of thing or not, I wanted to just address the fact that he is. And he's slid into that spot. And I want to kind of talk about why a little bit later. And then Archbishop Oscar Romero is another really good one. Can also be tossed into the category of religious. But he was shot and killed in the 80s after he delivered a sermon in which he called, and he was really outspoken. There was a conflict in El Salvador where he was the archbishop, and soldiers were killing poor folks and basically people who didn't have a voice. And so he demanded that the soldiers in the state stop killing people, and that didn't go over too well, and so he was assassinated for that, and he became a martyr in El Salvador and then also for the church, but he's largely considered, I'm putting him in the secular category because he's another person who I would identify as a political martyr, like MLK, who, though he was religious and religiously founded, was not killed for those things necessarily. And then I want to shift into, I know that that was really brief. There are a ton of secular modern martyrs. I had to pick a few, or else I could have gone on for a really, really, really long time. There are also a lot of people who maybe aren't listed anywhere who would be a good argument for being martyrs. I'm not saying that they're not. I just don't have time to do that. We'll be here for forever. But I did want to slip into from secular, even though people from the secular age were what I would consider part of like the modern age, or the age that we live in, whatever we want to call that. I'm going to talk about people who kind of pivoted what I think of as a martyr, but I'm still going to call them martyrs because they are socially, in this case, sacrificing themselves or crawling up on their cross over their beliefs. And they're suffering often social ostracization and exile. Did you have something to say, Teresa? Or Pastor Teresa? No? Okay, I just saw your little screen light up. I want to make sure I didn't leave anyone out. So the first person I want to touch on is Kimberly Jean Davis. Kim Davis refused to approve same-sex couples' marriage licenses. Same-sex marriage licenses, saying that doing so would violate the tenets of her religion. She was tried in court and found guilty and actually held in contempt of court and jailed for 5 days. I think she's made her way into state representative group, or she was a state representative for a while. But she, in doing this, lost a lot of love from progressives and gained a lot of love from more conservative Christian groups. But she experienced a lot of social ostracization after she refused to do this and got a lot of heat on social media. And then kind of in tandem with this, I want to talk about the people who ran the Masterpiece Cake Shop in Colorado. The owners of this bake shop were asked to bake a wedding cake for a queer couple, and they refused, citing that it would be in direct violation of their religious beliefs to do so, and that marriage was only between a man and a woman, and that they were not required to make a cake for these folks. They took that, I think actually the people who wanted the cake sued, and that was taken up to the Colorado council. I can't remember which council it was, but that council found that they had to bake the cake. It did not infringe upon their religious liberties, and they needed to move on. But they weren't happy with that, so they appealed up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court disagreed with the council, saying that it was indeed their right to decide, and that they did not have to do that. But these folks felt so strongly, both Kimberly Davis, and she goes by Kim Davis, and the folks at the Masterpiece Cake Shop felt so strongly that this social ask, this like worldly temporal ask, was so contrary to what they believed that it would be in direct violation of their religion in order to supply those services. And they felt as if they were being persecuted by the government and the secular peoples, whatever that means. It's not just secular people either. They're progressive, or not progressive, but progressive Christians as well. But they, I think, martyred themselves in a sense, for better or for worse. We'll talk about that in a minute too. But that's kind of a new take on martyrdom, I guess. And then to get into two really timely examples of like modern social media age martyrdom, there are 3 Texas pastors right now who are claiming religious persecution for not being exempted from stay-at-home orders. So there are 3 pastors in Texas led by Stephen Hotza, who are suing because the state forced them to shut down in-person services because they were in violation of the shelter in place. They're saying that this is in violation of their religious liberties. I read their case and didn't find many compelling arguments for the contrary, or that they were being violated. They were told that they couldn't be pastors to their people. They were just told that they had to do it in a safe way. But they're currently leading a big charge against Texas to be allowed to do that. And their main argument is the virus isn't as bad as the flu, and the government should not stand in the way of religious practices or religious gatherings. And then another one that's kind of a little bit different. I don't have much sympathy for the aforementioned martyrs, but this one is one that's more near and dear to my heart because I've seen this happen to people in my life. Gerald Bostock, he worked in a government position in Clayton County, I think, but he was fired for being gay. They accused him of misappropriating funds and using it to recruit and fund for his gay softball league. That's the exact words that they used whenever they accused him. And he was fired just for being gay and is currently in the process of appealing that. I think he went to the Supreme Court in September of last year, which would mean that his decision is probably going to be handed down in June of this year, just due to how the court cycles and works and when they reach and release their main decisions. So I guess the jury's still out on that one and we'll see, but hopefully he won't become another martyr for just existing and being who he is and living his life. That happened to a lot of teachers that are not a lot of teachers. One teacher I had in particular, and then a couple other teachers I know. I'm from Georgia, so they were fired just basically under suspicion of being gay. Maybe people, I don't know. It's complicated, but there are still states in this country where you can be fired just for being any kind of queer, which is really unfortunate. And I think that those folks who would rather live as themselves than hide who they are martyrs in a whole new sense, even though there wasn't necessarily a loss of life. He lost his job and his well-being and his manner of supporting himself and his family, as did many other teachers. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp martyr on that. Does anyone have any comments or questions about modern or secular martyrs, or do you disagree with my designation in making some of these folks martyrs? I know it's kind of a weird way to look at it.
It's interesting that you bring up how you look at for instance, the cake people, the bakers. And, you know, I don't really think martyr when I think that. And I guess, you know, my take on martyrs a lot in history is that they were really good people in whatever way, or to have such a belief. And then to have another take of disagreeing with them, you know, who decides, you know, I guess martyr is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. There's that martyr is just martyr, you know, that I can't, there's not a value that I can put on a martyr and say all martyrs are good or all martyrs are bad. It's more about belief, I guess. You know, that's an interesting question. I do believe that Dan White did kill Harvey Milk and Moscone because of the progression of gays and lesbians in politics in San Francisco. That is one of my beliefs. So that's a really interesting question to me. And I just have to make one side note joke. I wouldn't want to eat that cake anyway.
Right.
But
I always thought about that. Like, just I would take my business elsewhere, but you know, also it's important to fight for that kind of thing. So, you know, I'm really torn in that respect. I don't want a homophobic cake. It probably doesn't taste as good.
Yeah, and this whole thing with the pastors, and you know, I know there was the one guy in Florida as well who was telling everybody to come out, and I just don't understand. I don't understand that mentality, and so that's puzzling to me. I'm a little like gobsmacked, they say in Britain, where you just like your jaws just hanging open, like what? you know, because I hadn't heard about the 3 Texas pastors, and I don't know. I just, it's hard to imagine that there's people like that in the 21st century who can't wed medical science and religion, that they here's another example of really strong separation, I guess, that they, I don't know. So that's all I have to say right now. I'm just a little gobsmacked.
Yeah, it's a whole lot. One second.
The martyrs that I'm thinking about are ones that aren't obvious. So in California, when they were turning off the power for the rolling blackouts, some disabled people died. But the police reports said, well, they didn't die because of the blackouts. They died because they were disabled. But like, that's because they got to write the report, not because the person wasn't begging for oxygen the whole time that this was happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. What were you going to say, Mom?
Karen, my name is Karen.
Karen, you don't want to be associated with this?
No, just be professional. Can I just say, since I was outed as your mother, I am so flippin' proud of you right now. And I'm so grateful to be here. Anyway, I'll stop.
Now who's not professional?
Me.
Woot woot!
But whenever, Jordan, you've talked about this throughout your presentation about whether they're a Christian martyr or they're not a Christian martyr or a social martyr or whatever. And even now, especially getting to these pastors who are claiming religious persecution. I think maybe what makes a martyr, even though we have definitions, or a big part of what makes someone a martyr is how they perceive themselves. And especially as someone who was raised in a very fundamentalist denomination, that kind of thing, like being persecuted for your faith, was glorified. Like, and how many times did I hear the verse, count it all, whatever the word is, that if you're persecuted for your faith, because that's evidence of you almost being an elect of God, that you would be singled out and you would be persecuted. And so whenever it comes down, and then also too, in relation to what Judith is saying about embodied, if you have theology that you have heard your whole life drummed into your head, you embody that way of being in the world. And so I think the definition and the line and the delineation, especially in a religious context, when it comes down to fundamentalists, is I lost my train of thought, but it comes down to whether or not some people, you could think you're a victim or a martyr, but I think the word victim has taken on, like, moved over to the word martyr, even without being killed. I mean, I take great issue with any of those folk right now who are running around tempting the Lord their God by showing up and being out in public and then being so arrogant as to saying, God's going to protect us. You all come to church. That's not a martyr to me. That's hubris. And I don't want to take in case it's a big point that you were about to make, but I don't want to take from you the very Southern saying that we have about people who would perceive themselves as martyrs when they indeed are not.
You can go ahead and take it if you'd like.
Well, the first time I heard it too, it was like, what? There's a phrase and it's very Southern, and it may be maybe used in other places too, but there's the saying, honey, get off the cross, we need the wood. as a way of just kind of calling out someone's hubris or woe is me. And again, back to the pastors who are defying the shelter in place and stay at home mandates. That's exactly what I'd like to say to them. Get off the cross. We need the wood. So.
Yeah. And so that brings me to an interesting point, all of these comments about, so as I said before, I had kind of a negative view of martyrs, just because of how I had always heard about them growing up, and then the kind of just things surrounding them. It just seemed really kind of like a lot, and like no one was asking for that, so why? You know, no one expected you to be so convicted that you would die. Jesus died. So one of the first connections that I made when I started thinking about this kind of on the other side of things, when I made a little bit more peace with religion and religious folks, and moved solidly back into the church, was noticing these folks as modern martyrs. Because of something that was said about early martyrs that kind of caused me to draw the connection. I was in, I think it was just church history last year, and we were reading a book by Margaret Miles called The Word Made Flesh. And it's actually pretty funny and pretty informative read. It's definitely a textbook, but if you like that kind of thing, maybe it would be interesting to you. But they talked about an old theory in the age of martyrdom, or the age of martyrs, I guess, which was kind of at the beginning of this whole phase, where so there was the belief that whenever you died, you just kind of went to sleep, and you waited for Jesus to come back. And that was kind of just the pervasive ideology, but a lot of folks were afraid, or maybe not necessarily afraid, but when you go to sleep and you have to wait for Jesus to come back, people don't like waiting. We've done so many studies where, you know, you offer someone $100 now or $200 in a week. What are they going to take the $100 now? Because just as people, we don't enjoy the waiting part of things. So there's this idea that martyrs who died in the faith, so for their religious convictions, maybe this would have applied to the time of Perpetua, but they would go to sleep and be revived instantly and brought into heaven instead of having to wait. And so for the people who died ordinary deaths, maybe just as, convicted in their Christianity, they would have to wait until the general resurrection just because of their manner of death. I think that maybe comes from the fact that Jesus died and ascended. And so in imitating Christ and taking that on yourself, that was something that you too could achieve. And that was kind of like, I don't know, imitation is the highest form of flattery. So maybe that won brownie points and got him in faster. But that kind of, so that kind of ticked something in my mind and raised a flag. And it started to make me think about the prosperity gospel. And so the prosperity gospel, for anyone who's not with that, is very big in the South where I came from. And it's the idea that you know that you are blessed if you have a lot of money, a lot of material possessions. Instead of saying one's wealthy, that's kind of a dirty thing to say, you say, I'm blessed. And that is the prosperity gospel. Basically, you know that you are elect because God has seen and taken it upon God's self to give you all the riches now and later. So you just super elect out. So the same idea applied to, in my thinking, martyrs who didn't want to wait to know whether or not they were chosen or elect or going to get a heaven, or didn't want to wait for the heavenly riches. So what do? You put your faith on display, much like people tout their wealth in various ways, saying that they're blessed or donating large amounts to charity and being very public about it, or having galas and that sort of thing to benefit the poor. Not that those aren't wonderful things and we shouldn't be having them. There's just a certain attitude that certain people have and certain things that certain people say that lean in the direction of what I would call bad theology. So I kind of married those two things, and that is how I came to see these modern, or like what I call the modern martyrs, or social media martyrs, I guess would be another term for them. that's how I kind of brought them into the martyr circle. It was through my kind of negatively thinking about martyrs and why they did what they did and who they were that I was able to make that connection. So the question on my mind is, why in God's name would people do this? People did do it in God's name. That's one. That's a gimme. Referring back to the same book, The Word Made Flesh by Miles, she gives 3 pretty good reasons that I think are kind of catch-alls for why folks would do this. One is literally, what would Jesus do? An answer to that question. He died, so they did too, in a kind of gruesome manner with a lot of suffering. The second was that martyrs were literally willing to die to get away from a cruel world. This is another point where I kind of found a way in for the prosperity gospel, or kind of it made space for my kind of funky feelings towards martyrs, because some of these people were so pious and convicted and convinced that they were doing religion the right way and they had the answers, that and everyone else was just cruel and awful and persecuting them, that they would rather die or socially martyr themselves to gain God's favor and get away from all of these other secular people who are not as holy or high and mighty. Reading a little bit of my own bias into that, but my talk, so I can. And the third was that martyrs were #blessed, as we said earlier, with a superior level of consciousness. She doesn't use the hashtag in her book, and another level of connection with Christ. So that's kind of just the election theology thing that I talked about earlier, and the prosperity gospel swing in again. I'm sure that there are a lot more reasons, and those are only religious reasons. So, we talked about political martyrs. They died to make lasting political or religious statements. Dying for your beliefs is pretty impactful, especially today. I feel like there are people who are willing to do that, but especially now that we have smartphones and can record everything and disseminate knowledge in a different way, it really makes a big impact. Judith, did you have something to say? You unmuted.
Oh, I'm just thinking about Martin Luther King and Romero and Milk, and thinking about, yes, they were very outspoken about their beliefs, but they didn't, and I'm sure they knew that they might die at some point because of it, but I don't think that was their intention. And, so I'm thinking about that in terms of, looking at modern martyrdom, and, having Pastor Teresa talk about disabled people who were unable to have oxygen and just thinking about kind of putting my brain around all of it. And, it's like, in some ways, I believe like martyrdom comes after death. And so, are you a martyr in death? There's so many definitions. Obviously, you told us 4 or 5 different definitions, but it's just, it's kind of wrapping my brain around it. You've had more time to think about it, but also, how do we, are you a martyr because you believed that you were doing what God said and not baking a cake? Really? I don't know. It's, maybe there's another word that's not martyr. I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking out loud. So excuse me for my pondering.
No,
some of the things that are up for me.
You are welcome. I provided all of those different definitions just kind of as a way of showing that no one's really necessarily on the same page, and there are super different criteria for what makes a martyr. So you certainly do not have to take my distinction or my kind of, I don't want to say new category. I'm probably not the first one that's ever thought of this, but taking my distinction, and you don't have to, that doesn't have to fit into your view of what a martyr is. You might not think that they're martyrs at all. Part of the reason I did include them, and I think someone mentioned it earlier, is because there's like an attitude. And I'm going to kind of get into more of those distinctions that people love so much, as you mentioned, Judith, in just a little bit, and kind of talk about a distinction within martyrdom, because I think that there's definitely a difference between people who would identify as martyrs and people who are actually martyred. I don't necessarily think that the folks who, I do think that the folks who wouldn't bake the cake, just for example, are martyrs because of, or not martyrs necessarily. I think they would call themselves martyrs because of the social and religious persecution that they received during and after the whole incident, and how, especially in like cancel culture today, we kind of send people away or send their ideas or being or relevance away. And that, I think in that moment, especially to at least a large group of the population, that was taken away from them. And so I would make that argument that might be a way to think of them as martyrs. Do I think that they're martyrs worthy of all this attention? No. So it's kind of a weird thing. Just like I don't believe that people who adhere to the prosperity gospel are any more blessed than anyone else just because they have money. But it's like, it's an attitude and something that warrants attention, even though I don't necessarily agree with it inherently, if that makes sense.
Maybe one thing I'd say about that is the difference between martyring yourself and being martyred for a cause.
Yes, and that's what I wanted to kind of end with. And I'll just go ahead and ask this question. Is martyrdom helpful or is it just extra at this point? Is there a distinction between like voluntary martyrdom and martyring yourself, and then being martyred, which I think leads perfectly into what you were saying. If you have any more to say on that, I'd love to hear it. I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just kind of trying to segue everyone into that next piece.
No, that's all. Just thinking about a lot of times if someone does it to themselves, I'm going to think, well, nobody asked you to do that, right? And also, There's a way. Like if they said, we couldn't bake this cake because we don't feel great about it, but we'd love to give you some phone numbers. Have a great week. Or, you know, we know, or something else. Here's $50 for the cake you do get. Then it's about relationship and not about being precious.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really important distinction, I think. So I wonder, so we've made I guess it seems like everyone here is in agreement that there's an important distinction that needs to be made within, like when we're looking at martyrs. Did people ask for that, or was it necessary? Yes, go.
I think back to how you see yourself and what Pastor Teresa just said. I think all of that comes into play. But as Pastor Teresa was speaking, whenever you think about Oscar Romero and you think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and you think about Marguerite Peretti and Joan of Arc, maybe not so much Marguerite Peretti and Joan of Arc because they could have recanted, but definitely Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he did not have the opportunity to recant. I mean, he was tried, and who knows, maybe even Marguerite and Joan, even if they had recanted, they still would have been burned at the stake. But I mean, I think if, you're trying to come up with a definition, not that that's what you're trying to do, but just in a way to think about this, martyrs don't have a choice. I liked what you said, Pastor Teresa, whenever you said it can be about relationship, and, you could offer someone and, here's money to go buy someplace else. I don't want to do this, but I mean, no one stood there and physically forced them to do anything. So back to also what Judith said about embodying something, like your beliefs are so much a part of who you are that you don't get to make the choice, but someone outside of you makes the choice for you. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So
that was I also kind of wanted to touch on. That was well said, and I won't go back to that, especially since we're coming up on time, and I want to be, or we might be past time actually, and I want to be respectful.
Did I repeat what you said, baby? I'm sorry.
No. I don't want to beat a dead horse and repeat what you said. That's perfectly said.
Okay.
That was kind of the next point, was that I don't, the piece about intention, and MLK and Harvey Milk and all of those folks not knowing that they were going to be killed, maybe affecting their martyr status. I don't know if you have to know, because I think it's just people who so ardently stood by their beliefs that they were killed for it. Because at any point, I guess they could have maybe recanted or decided to kind of remain more off to the side and quiet about it. But like MLK was an outspoken, you know, I mean, they each had their issues that they were very for. Would they have necessarily, did they intend to die for them? But their deaths for them, I don't know. Did you have a comment?
Oh, I was just thinking about what you said and about hiding out. And I was thinking about how when we are truly in ourselves, we can't hide out. And so, you know, I just started a new job and I wasn't sure how the organization felt about lesbians. And so I felt myself pulling back slightly and just making sure that I knew before I felt safe. And so, you know, when do we just thinking about some of the people that we said about them being so convicted in who they are and what they're doing and how they're doing it, that they just move forward no matter what, including Perpetua. I mean, you know, she's saying, I'm a Christian and this is who I am, you know. I don't know. I think it's a lot about about a conviction. There seems to be something about conviction. And then I go back to what Pastor Teresa said about the people who I believe were martyred, who, you know, the disabled people who couldn't get their oxygen. So, you know, there's so many ways to go around it. But I think I'm glad I have joined in on this conversation, because otherwise I just wouldn't, you know, it's opening my mind to think about this in a new way, and, you know, to have these conversations and not just be in church thinking about this, but being in the world thinking about this and what that all means. So I'm grateful that I came on.
Well, I'm glad you're here too. You've brought a lot of interesting and really eye-opening insight. You've caused me to think about a lot as well. So, you know, it's a nice exchange that we've got going. So the kind of last piece that I want to talk about is something that was brought to my attention semi-recently. And so just in being in seminary, and I'm in a public theology class right now, and I'm taking ministry across cultures. We've been talking about Christian ethics and what are we obligated to do. And I've been thinking a lot, I can't remember where I read this, but there is a call that's issued to people who are going into ministry or serving, or not even just going into ministry. I believe lay people are responsible for answering this call too. And it's, are you going to be a chaplain or a priest of the empire, or a chaplain of the resistance? I personally hope that I fall on the resistance side of things. And recently, as in this morning, I began to wonder if maybe this is the flipping of the script from the empire, from church resisting empire to church becoming empire. And looking at these martyrs, just look at the ladies who were martyred. They don't exactly hold ideas or convictions that to us seem weird or strange, but the church silenced them because of their heretical views, which is kind of in opposition to the first few martyrs that we looked at who were martyred by the state because they were trying to just live their lives as Christians. So we see the church on kind of the state is above the church in this instance, and it's kind of crushing the church. But over time, and I think with Marguerite and Joan, we see the church crushing people who are different and would seek to defy the church. So I wonder if this is kind of a narrative of how the church has become empire. And then we see with the secular martyrs, in my opinion, people who have become complicit and very comfortable in what they think is a protection for an overarching, all-encompassing church that governs. In the cases of the secular folks that I talked about, or the modern folks I talked about, not secular, they believe that these comforts should be afforded to them within their social and secular lives, outside of the church, forcing all people, even those who aren't religious, to adhere to their religious beliefs. So I kind of just wonder what that means. And like I said, that's a really new idea to me, so I don't know what it means yet. Does anyone have any thoughts surrounding that or anything? It's okay if you don't. I can also just move on. I have like one last piece. All right.
I think, especially whenever you think about the Inquisitions and the witch trials, and not just the witch trials that happened in Salem, but witch trials all over the world, it is estimated that some scholars believe between 5 and 10 million women have been executed under the term witch. And so it was, I think at a certain point, maybe it became easier to malign the character of and men were executed as witches as well. People who at the time probably would have identified as transgender, people who were on the margins and weren't like, at the center of what culture thought that they should be. But I do think that this is an example of how the church became the empire. I am very fond of using the word, using the phrase that when how Constantine's conversion, the church and empire finally got in bed together and made ugly babies. But so I think as the church became empire and we went from a place of where Jesus was very inclusive of women, and right now I've been spending a lot of time with Mary Magdalene and recovering her story and how she, was marginalized by the disciples, and eventually fled to France of all places. I think it's evolved. It did evolve from the church being this little radical place to becoming the power. And as it became the power, those in power were able to decide, obviously what was right. I mean, councils and everything like that happened. And so women then were speaking, and so it wasn't just that maybe they disagreed with what it meant to, what their version of God looked like, but maybe also, this person has a crazy version of God and they're in a body that's not cishet white male. So I definitely think, and just to add a little bit more about like the modern context with Kim Davis and with the cake bakers and the Texas, and there is very much a lot of Christian nationalistic privilege that is built into that perspective. Like, this, and again, this is the right kind of Christianity. This is the approved one by God. And so therefore, everyone else who doesn't think that, they're discriminating against me. I'll stop talking now.
I just, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, it's okay. Keep going, Judith.
I just, thank you for what you said, Karen. And the word that came to mind was patriarchy. Yeah, that's all I have to say. That's enough.
Someone else have something to say as well? I just wanted to make sure. You made me think of something interesting, and then thinking of it as resisting empire and Christianity being on the underside of that and not flipping to the top side of that. I wonder if we can really create any more Christian martyrs since we have become the empire. I wonder what that means, because it seems like a lot of these folks are resisting empire within the church and then within the world, and the church was a part of that and seems to go back and forth between being a part of that on and off. And I wonder how authentically we can create Christian martyrs if the thing that we're resisting, at least in the US context, that's the only one from which I can speak, if the church is empire, because it is so ingrained in every aspect of our lives. Like we live in a real Christocentric world, at least here. Our laws, the way that the laws are carried out, the way that we appoint and elect and think about politicians. I mean, I wonder what that means. And then the last question that I have, I don't have an answer to it, but are we ever called to martyr? Is this a holy charge? Are we taking it too far? The verse that comes to mind is John 15:13 especially, but I'll read a little bit around that because I really don't like just reading one verse at a time. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. This is the verse in particular. Pardon? No. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. And important verse. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing, but I have called you friends because I have made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and I appointed you to go and bear fruit that will last, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask him in my name. I'm giving you these commands so that you may love one another. Sorry for the gendered reading. I generally don't gender, but I just wonder, I wonder if we're missing the point in, I guess, at least voluntary martyrdom, in going forward and doing the things that the cake bakers or Kim Davis, who refused to sign marriage licenses, did. Because it seems like the bigger call here is to sacrifice for your friends and your community, and not yourself. And I guess maybe sacrificing self could be a sacrifice for friends and community in the greater scheme of things. Maybe I'm looking at it from a narrow method, but do y'all have any thoughts about that, or any closing statement or anything? Am I just horribly heretical and you disagree with me? That's okay too.
I have two things. One is just a little further back about empire. So I find that the devotion that I would accomplish is sometimes limited by capitalism generally, right? So I can't feed everyone that I want to feed because I don't have access to that resource that way, for example. And I just find that a struggle that makes it so that I might tip one way or the other in being more closely aligned with empire or liberation. And then the other piece is just, for me, I'm gonna be thinking about the difference for me between consecration and saying like, oh, now this is like a martyr kind of practice.
That's interesting, thank you. Consecration versus martyr practices. I'm gonna have to think about that one too. Karen, any closing words, anything you want to say?
I really enjoyed this conversation. I've enjoyed being in a space with people who are thoughtful and have had different experiences from me. And I just have to say, I think you did an amazing job, and I'm super proud.
Thanks. All right. Well,
And I love you.
I love you too. All right. Well, that is pretty much everything that I have to say for the moment. Feel free to comment and let me know if you agree or disagree or agree with anything in particular that I said. All comments are welcome. Just be kind.
Bye. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.